Good Monday morning. This is Focus on the News. We are at December the 18th, 2023, and we will have hit Christmas by the next time that we're together. In any event, I wish all of you a very good Christmas season, and hopefully we'll have an improved new year. I think we'll have a lot of good news coming up as we get closer to election time. And elections are never a guarantee of anything, but at least they offer hope, and that's what we would like. Okay, I've got today we've got a very important guest coming in from Berlin, but first I want to touch on a couple of topics independent of that. Perhaps as sort of a nasty Christmas surprise, the Biden administration is preparing to tear down the Confederate Memorial that was placed in Arlington National Cemetery many years ago as a symbol of national reconciliation and the healing of the wounds of America's greatest war, which was the war between the states. This memorial was put in place by President McKinley, who had fought for the Union. He was a Union soldier, saw combat in the war between the states, and he saw the erection of the memorial and the collection of Confederate dead into the Arlington Cemetery as a means of healing the wounds of the nation, reuniting everyone, and he did it very successfully. It was a tremendous success at the time, and very, very beautiful memorial that has quietly rested there as sort of a historical monument, and also a way of honoring all of the people who died. We all are Americans, and there were people on both sides of that war. In any event, what happened is the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021 was passed during a wave of enormous racial violence and hatred spurred by the George Floyd race riots. And there were decisions made to expunge as much of white history from America as possible, particularly focused on southern states. The NDAA of 2021 had language saying that they would remove all names, symbols, displays, monuments that commemorate the Confederate States of America, or any person who served voluntarily with the Confederate States of America. Well, that was like, a major part. The southern states were not as populous as the northern states, and yet still, I don't know, that might have been 40% of all of America that suddenly, by this National Defense Authorization Act, was sort of being written out of history and purged from the records of the nation. Very shortly after this was done, the Department of Defense began they carried out a DoD-wide stand down to purge the military of what they called extremist elements, people who were excessively patriotic, I suppose. And as a result, this really sent a message that America has changed. It is no longer united. It is divided by racial hatred and violence. And as a consequence, we saw military recruiting collapse because people were saying, "Look, I don't want to serve in an institution that hates my guts." So who knows? I don't know where we are headed, but hopefully we will get new leadership in the country, and we can hopefully reconstitute what this nation was. Okay, the next topic I want to touch on is there was a strange situation. I suspect it's more common than we would like to recognize, but there was a senior Democrat Senate staffer working in the U.S. Senate, and he was reportedly fired after being caught anally sodomizing another man in the Judiciary room of the Hart Senate office building. I gather that they were making some gay pornography, and the Daily Caller cited this scandal, and it had obtained a video of the act taking place. Said the staffer was wearing nothing but a jockstrap, engaged in anal sex with an older man on a table. That's according to the Daily Caller. And it did say it was in the Judiciary room located in the Hart Senate office building. And then an organization called Netizens got to the bottom of the affair, and they identified a staffer for Democratic Senator Ben Cardin. And the staffer name is Sozopsky, and he was quoted as saying, "This has been a difficult time for me as I've been attacked for who I love." Well, I don't think this kind of stuff has anything to do with who you love. It has a lot to do with the level of depravity that has infected our government at the very highest levels. And it's really a sad commentary on where we are as a country, that people feel free in the Judiciary office of the Hart Senate office building. They feel empowered to where they can actually carry out these acts of depravity in a somewhat public setting there. I'm sure they weren't doing it on display, but anyway, it's kind of it almost encapsulates where our government has gone, how morally corrupt they are. Okay, well, with that, I want to get into something that I think there are signs of hope here and there, and then there are signs of big problems also. But we're going to shift over to Germany. We have a very distinguished foreign policy analyst, Mr. Harley Schlanger. He is with the German Bureau of the Schiller Institute, and he joins us today from Berlin. So Harley, welcome to the show. We're looking forward to hearing your commentary on the latest from Berlin and from Germany and perhaps Europe as a whole.
Well, good morning, Senator Black. And I have to tell you, unfortunately, the story of what the defilement of the Senate office building did come over here to Germany, and people are scratching their heads wondering what this means about the United States. But if you look at the German situation, you see they should be looking more closely at what's going on inside Germany. I just returned from, I'm actually living outside of Berlin, but I was in Berlin today. There was a tractorcade. Farmers from all over the north of Germany were driving through the streets of Berlin, by the Victory Arch, by the Brandenburg Gate, and they're protesting the government's decision to try and balance the budget by cutting subsidies for diesel fuel for farmers. Now, we can go into this if you want. There's an incredible budget crisis, which is the result of the complete incompetence or deliberate efforts at transition from the current government, the so-called coalition government of the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Free Democrats. But what they've done is they've blown a hole in the budget. They tried to paper over it, and the Constitutional Court said you can't do it. So it took 60 billion euros away from the government spending. So instead of taking it out of such things as the war in Ukraine, for example, they're taking it out of food production, they're taking it out of education, they're taking it out of healthcare. And as a result, the government, the three parties are at record lows in the polls. The three parties together add up to about 34%. So that's bad news for the coalition government. But one of the signs in the tractorcade that was very prominent everywhere was our Christmas wish, a new government. And there are not elections coming up for more than a year. But the question is, will the Schultz coalition government make it for a year?
Yeah. Now, Harley, I'm curious. Under the German system, I know in a lot of parliamentary systems, you can have a vote of no confidence. Is that something that works within the German system?
Yeah, that's something that could happen. The problem is, if you look at the polls, the leading party in the polls now is the Christian Democrats. And they're at about 32% in this most recent poll, compared to the Social Democrats of Schultz, 15%. The Greens have collapsed to 12%, and the Free Democrats to 5%. So the CDU is equal, that is, the Conservative Party is equal to the other three parties. But that doesn't give them a majority to form a government. And the problem they have is to form a government, they'd either have to have a grand coalition with the Social Democrats, which at this point seems unlikely, or the party that's moving up in the polls, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is considered the far right party, the CDU doesn't want to get into a coalition with them because they've been under attack from the government for so long. So the attempt to bring down the coalition would lead to chaos because there's no obvious alternative. So I think what we're going to see is more chaos, more economic problems. The other side to this is the current government. The defense minister, Pistorius, put out a statement about 10 days ago saying that Germany must become war ready. And he said, because if the Ukraine government collapses and Putin wins, then we're going to have to be prepared to deal with Putin in a war in Europe. Now, besides the fact that that's a completely incompetent assessment of what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia, the idea that the German people are being told you have to cut the budget so we can build more tanks, missiles, recruit more people to the Bundeswehr, it's just not going to sell. And so, and then you think about it from the Russian standpoint. The idea that the Russians are looking at Germany, preparing tanks to roll across Ukraine toward Russia. Anyone in Germany who has any memory at all should realize that that's really a provocation for war with Russia. So, I think the situation has gotten so bad that they don't know what to do. They don't know whether to bring down the government, to call for new elections. I think there are going to be some regional elections coming up at the beginning of next year, and we'll see what happens there. The regional elections are going to be in the eastern sector of the country, which means that the AfD will continue to get a lot of votes. They just won a mayor's race in Saxony. So if that happens, the CDU is going to be under increasing pressure to possibly form a coalition with them. The AfD is under pressure to tone down some of their rhetoric, especially on immigration. So it's going to be a fascinating situation, but the problem is the collapse of Germany means the collapse of Europe. And the policies of the current government are deindustrialization. The auto sector, the driver of the economic miracle in Germany, the driver of European engineering and technology, the auto sector is collapsing. They made a big bet on the electric car industry, and now they're all going out of that because of the problems with the whole green transition. So, if you're looking for a silver lining in the situation, the German people are going to have to start thinking. In Germany, the situation has been fairly good in the last 20 years, a strong economy, strong exports, but they've been chipping away at the productive sector largely as a result of the green policy. And without energy, without cheap oil and gas, without nuclear power, that's been shut down. So without that, Germany is really in what Mrs. LaRouche calls a fundamental crisis.
Yeah.
And I don't see leaders in any of the parties addressing this.
Well, it seems that from an economic standpoint, if you think of an economic pyramid within Germany and then going out to the rest of the European Union, at the very top of the pyramid is cheap natural gas, which came from Russia. It was cheap. It was the Germans were early pioneers in the modern chemical industry. In Ludwigshafen, we've got an enormous complex of chemical plants, 3,100 factories in all. The biggest chemical center on earth, bigger than anything in China, bigger than anything in the US. And it all began with natural gas coming in and using the Haber method. They combined air and natural gas, and then they would produce ammonia, and then they would produce ammonium nitrate for fertilizer, and then get more and more complex as you go down the chain. And then they finally were producing the most sophisticated reagents in the world. All of those chemical products feed into things such as plastics and paint and everything that is produced industrially in Europe. And you had this tremendous partnership between Russia, which provided enormous quantities of natural resources and especially the natural gas, and then you have this tremendous manufacturing history in Germany, where so much is produced so effectively. And I was noticing that there is very substantial trouble on the industrial front in Germany, a very sharp decline in manufacturing orders. The industrial orders had been expected to go up 0.2%, but instead they dropped 3.7%. That is a stunning decline of 4% from what was anticipated almost. And within the manufacturing sector, they suffered a truly withering plunge in machinery and equipment. And the new orders dropped by an adjusted 13.5%. I mean, this is I won't say it's falling into depression territory, but it's certainly very severely in a recession there. And then,
it's an official recession, but the element that's driving it that you're talking about is the German economic miracle was based on engineering, especially in what's called the Mittelstand, the small and medium entrepreneurs, the machine tool sector, the scientific research and development sector. And Germany made a bet that they could move ahead in computer chips, and then they found out that you need energy for that. And so the orders and the contracts that were set up for that have collapsed. About 1/3 of the companies that feed into the auto sector are either shutting down or leaving the country because of the lack of available and efficient and cheap energy. And of course, the reason for this is twofold. One, the green policy, which shut down nuclear power. The last nuclear plant was shut down about a year ago. and that was allegedly because of the aftermath of Fukushima. And then secondly, it's because of the Ukraine war and the sanctions against Russia. And then third, the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. And so all of these are, you might say, self-inflicted, although it wasn't the Germans who blew up the pipeline, but they're not saying anything about who they think did. And so we're seeing a national suicide, because the key to German economic growth has been this idea of credit directed to the areas where you can immediately create increases in wealth production, namely physical economy, the machine tool sector, the engineering sector, scientific and technological advance. You cut that out. And by the way, also agriculture, because you mentioned the feeder stock from petroleum and natural gas for fertilizer. So the cost of food is skyrocketing in Germany, energy costs are skyrocketing, and now the government has no money to give subsidies to people who can't afford it. So, and this has an effect throughout the European Union. So that's really the catastrophe, and you're absolutely right that you start with the most advanced sectors, and if you tear them down, you're left with virtually no driver for the economy. And that's what's happening in Germany right now.
Yes, we have a comment from Nordic Sky. Says when the U.S. blew up the pipelines that supplied Germany with cheap energy, that meant big trouble for the German economy. And I think that's a pretty good summary of it. Now, within the among the foreign policy intelligentsia in the United States, it is sort of an open secret that the United States planned and executed a very sophisticated operation to destroy Germany and Europe's natural gas pipeline, and that's, you know, there are a lot of the sort of the globalist oriented people who say, oh no, but in fact, you know, when we first did it, within moments there was a communique intercepted between Liz Truss, Prime Minister of England or Great Britain, and she was communicating with Tony Blinken at the Department of State, and she sent a very cryptic message: "It's done."
Yeah.
Well, what's done? Well, what happened 60 seconds earlier is done, and that was that the U.S. With help from Norway, from help from Britain, and so forth, had destroyed the lifeblood of Europe, which was cheap Russian natural gas. And
well, to go back to the point you were making before about the potential for an alliance between Germany and Russia that would benefit both of them, this has been a target of the Anglo-American establishment going back to the end of the 19th century. This is where the whole idea of geopolitics from Halford Mackinder and the Royal Geographical Society and British imperial policy was that you can never allow a German-Russian alliance, because that will pave the way for an intersection, or an interconnection, I should say, from Eurasia and Western Europe through Russia. And if you then connect that through things such as the Berlin to Baghdad pipeline into the Middle East, then the whole power of the British Imperial Navy is diminished and defeated. So the whole idea was to avoid a Russia-German alliance. And we had the Triple Entente before World War I. We saw after World War I the attempt at Rapallo to have a German-Russian escape valve from the punishment of Germany through the Versailles Treaty. That was ended by the assassination of the author of that policy, Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister of Germany. The same thing in 1989, 1990, when there was a potential for Germany to come in after the collapse of the Soviet Union and help the Russians develop their physical economy. Instead, they sent in bankers and real estate contractors to loot Russia. And now we're seeing the same thing with Ukraine being used to try to weaken, as Austin said, or to destroy Russia, to have regime change in Russia. Again, because of the fear of the shift in the world economy from speculative finance, from the role of the City of London and Wall Street, into an organizational commitment to mutual cooperation through economic development, which takes away the power of the credit of the City of London and Wall Street. So, we've been arguing for a long time that the reason the pipeline was blown up was not just to weaken Germany and Europe, but to continue this process of preventing what Mackinder, the founder of geopolitics, warned about, which was a connection between Central Europe and the world island and Russia and Asia. And instead, because of these policies, what they're doing is they're increasing the rate at which that new alliance is taking place. So it's a classic example of absolutely faulty thinking and the use of military policy to back it up. And the real question I think that Seymour Hersh posed is, Biden said to Schultz, we're not going to let you have the pipeline. It's not going to happen. And that was out in the open. And then after the pipeline was blown up, Germany remained silent, which means it remained subservient to the US control of NATO. And that's why, I do a lot of meetings with people in German politics, some Bundestag members and others. And the unspoken understanding they all have is that Germany is not a sovereign nation. Germany's sovereignty is in the pocket of NATO and the United States.
So much of American foreign policy rests on illusions. And I was stationed in Germany, and that was from 81 to 84, and had a very dear friend, Heinz Jabone. He had been the ice skating champion of Poland until 1939, because he was an ethnic German, with the division of Poland between the Soviet Union and Germany, he was drafted into the Luftwaffe. And anyway, he ended up in the little village where I lived in Heltersburg, met his wife there, and she told stories about how she would carry food up to Heinz and the other NCOs who manned a radar station, and she would watch the American planes. They knew they were there, and they would fly very low, and they'd search for them. They never did find the radar station, but in any event, Heinz loved good scotch, and so I would bring him scotch from the American commissary, and we would sit around in his home, and I was quite surprised one time. He was very pro-American, but one night as he was sipping scotch, he said, I just wish that the United States would sign a peace treaty with Germany and end the war. And I was quite confused, and even to this day, I don't have precise parameters of where this stands, but what he was saying is that the U.S. has never entirely made peace with Germany, and I found that view was shared by other Germans. And then gradually you begin to see the outlines, because the Supreme Allied Commander Europe has been an American since 1945. There's no talk about, well, why don't we switch it and we'll have NATO commanded by Europeans, because it's after all it's based in Europe, but you begin to realize that the people of Europe, and particularly the people of Germany, have almost no voice in their own affairs,
Mhm.
and they are simply dominated by the United States, which has this very it's a very shrewd approach to where we have an empire which is every bit as real and physically existent as the British Empire,
Mhm.
but nobody knows it exists. It's just there. But if we decide that we're going to cut off the Europe's lifeblood of economic success by destroying the Nord Stream pipeline, we simply go out and we do it. And you mentioned Hal Mackinder. Hal Mackinder was talking about the heartland theory, I think back in 1904.
Yeah.
And Britain was preparing for the next big war. The public thinks these wars just suddenly burst into blossom, but wars are planned sometimes decades ahead of time. We prepared the Second World War long before it ever began. But anyway, Hal Mackinder is very interesting. He had this heartland theory, which warned Britain. Britain had always relied on control of the seacoast as a way of choking off supplies to any army. And while it didn't choke them off overnight, over time, it just became more and more difficult for armies to fight on continental areas. And he said, look, you better watch out because there are three great river basins in Europe and Asia, sort of the landmass there that forms Europe and Russia. And he says, if somehow things work out to where they began communicating within the landmass and they are able to ship things on these great rivers and begin to communicate that way and not rely so much on the seacoast, then you better watch out because that's where the power lies. And so
it was also, Senator Black, it was also an attack on the idea of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, because what the Russians and the Germans saw was what Lincoln did with the Transcontinental Railroad to pull the United States together, the whole continent. And this was what Sergei Witte, who was the treasurer to the Tsar, the chief advisor to Tsar Nicholas, he was promoting this, the idea of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The French were interested in it. The Germans were, of course, also, because the vast raw material wealth of Russia, if there were a way to cheaply move that by land to make it accessible to Western Europe, this is what the whole heartland is about. How do you keep that divided? Because if they come together through rail, through rivers and so on, then what's the leverage, the power that the British have? And there was an American author who also played into this, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote The Influence of Sea Power in History, which was one of Teddy Roosevelt's favorite books. And this was something that was shaping an alliance to try to bring the United States in as a partner with the British Empire. Despite our anti-imperial history, our anti-colonial history, to try to make the United States a party of this British Empire. And World War I, as you point out, there was the humiliating defeat of France at Fashoda in Africa. There was the Dreyfus Affair, the destruction of the French officer corps, and eventually the French oriented toward the British with the Entente Cordiale. And then after the British financed Japan in the war against Russia in 1904 and 1905, and Russia went through chaos with a revolution, they brought Russia in. So you had the Triple Entente, the Brits, the French, and the Russians, which paved the way for World War I by 1907. So it wasn't just the assassination of the Archduke, in Sarajevo that caused World War I, just as it was not the launching of the special military operation in February 2022 that created the Ukraine crisis. So you're absolutely right about that. But the problem is, who in the West studies history this way? It used to be that this was the centerpiece of an intelligence community, studying history, national cultures, connecting the relationship between advances in science and technology and economics to politics. Today, we're clueless, we're blind. And so when something like the Nord Stream pipeline is blown up, people immediately, what was the first thing they said? The Russians did it.
Yes.
Of course, it made absolutely no sense. And how many people realize that it wasn't just Russia and Germany, but there were 10 other European nations that were involved in it. So it was a continent-wide program, which is precisely what this heartland theory was designed to prevent, that relationship between Western and Central Europe with Eurasia. And as I said, the irony is that because of these kinds of policies, we're creating a shift in world power toward Eurasia, toward Asia, away from the dollar. And when the US does things like sanctioning countries and taking away their dollar reserves, you weaken the trust in the dollar, and that's why there's a de-dollarization taking place. So when you look at the Western establishment, you see what I would say is an arrogance that basically says, we own the rules-based order and we can make the rules. But increasingly, countries in the world are saying, these are not rules. The rules we're going to follow are the UN Charter, the international law, and not what Tony Blinken says the rules are. And if this doesn't change quickly, the United States is going to be discredited and isolated because of our policies in Ukraine, our policies with the Middle East, and our policies with the developing sector as a whole by demanding that they adhere to the International Monetary Fund guidelines, which is essentially a neo-colonial looting policy. So the world is shifting right in front of us, but because of the corrupt media and censorship and lack of understanding of history, people don't see it.
Well, I agree with you completely. It's ironic that it is the United States that is driving Russia and China together. Historically, Russia and China they've had border frictions and so forth. They've had military clashes and so forth. They would not be naturally inclined to be terribly close to one another, but we have just, dealt hammer blows to both of them, and we have forced them to increase their cooperation enormously. And I think once these channels of communication and flows of economic activity are established, they're not going to just go away overnight. They're going to continue, and probably they'll just continue to grow and flourish. So it's just ironic the enormous short-sightedness of the Biden administration and administrations before them, but particularly Biden. It's sort of been on speed during this administration, but you can link it to what happened with the Obama administration, which overthrew Ukraine in 2014, and the CIA and the MI6, British MI6, helped to turn ordinary protest into violent revolution. Not the first time we've done it. I'm sure somewhere in the halls of the Central Intelligence Agency, there's got to be a little pamphlet that's about 20 pages where you flip through. Okay, here's how you overthrow a government: A, B, C, D.
Well, let me make just a couple of comments on these ironies. The idea that sanctions will work and will weaken Russia. It's had a boomerang effect. It weakened our allies, and it forced Russia to figure out how to invest effectively in their own economy. And so Russia, in the midst of a war, is now between 3 and 4% positive growth rate for their economy for this year, while Europe is negative growth and heading to a depression. Then here's another question, though, which I think is an important one, because this is where geopolitics intrudes itself. Remember, Henry Kissinger, the late, unlamented, departed former Secretary of State, thought that keeping Russia and China against each other, playing them off against each other, was the best thing for the US to do. And this was part of his shuttle diplomacy wherever he went, to try, and it's classic divide and conquer. But why is it that a Russia-China alliance would be a threat to the United States? If we have competent economic policies, we could be a partner with them. That's what Putin just said in his end of the year address the other day. We have no fundamental issues with the United States. We recognize it as a great power. And if it stops acting like an empire, we are happy to work with it. There's a history of Russian-US alliance going back to the League of Armed Neutrality at the time of the American Revolution and during the Civil War, which you were talking about earlier, when the Russians sent their fleet to New York and San Francisco to try to head off the possibility of a British naval embargo against the North during the Civil War. And then we were allies in World War I and World War II. So there's no inherent reason why the US and Russia couldn't work for mutual benefit, nor with China. But there's the thinking that geopolitics has is that the world is a zero-sum game. If one country does better, it will be at our expense. And so therefore, our job is to make sure it's at some other country's expense and pit countries against each other to enable ourselves to be above it. But what happens when the policies in the United States or in the United Kingdom are wrong and weaken our country? Then the attempt to continue that divide and conquer is going to be through expenditures in military, which will weaken our own country, as opposed to working together for things such as an international improvement in maritime trade, in overland trade, rail, cooperation in space, cooperation in fighting disease. There's so many things we could do together, but by adopting this attitude that there are incompatible systems, we ignore what John Kennedy was getting at after June 1963, when he said that, look, we and the Russians have a lot in common. And even though we don't like their system, there's no reason we can't work together. And I think that had a lot to do with why John Kennedy was killed. And so I think we need a total rethinking outside of geopolitics, which means outside of zero-sum thinking, outside of austerity economics, outside of using sanctions and war as a political policy, and instead get back to diplomacy. It's not a sign of weakness to negotiate a cooperation. That's partly what's holding back Ukraine, because Biden won't admit that it was a mistake to do what he did. NATO won't admit it. So how many more Ukrainians have to die? How many more Russians have to die? For what? A few inches here and there across the Dnieper River? It makes no sense. But this is where you need diplomats. And I think people like Brzezinski and Kissinger and Madeleine Albright gave diplomacy a bad name.
Well, we certainly are not in the in a time where American diplomacy amounts to anything. I mean, basically, diplomacy is where you go and you threaten somebody, and if they don't do what you want, you kill them.
Here comes NATO.
I don't think that's diplomacy. And our foreign policies have been so uniformly disastrous you go back to the George Bush days, particularly, where he began this massive war on the Middle East, where we've been killing Arabs for the last 34 years, nonstop. I mean, we've killed Arabs somewhere in the Middle East, and it was peaceful before that. It was a people were living happy lives in the Middle East, and then George Bush said, "Hey, let's raise some Cain," and you have to look back and say, okay, what have we achieved? What positive thing has happened for the American people because of this?
But that's the result of this geopolitical thinking, and behind geopolitics is economics of the few, the corporate cartels, the City of London financial networks, the big pharma, the big oil. That essentially their view is that they'll use the military power of the United States and NATO and the economic power of the control of credit of Wall Street and the City of London to dictate terms to the world over and above sovereign governments. That's why the whole World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, people talk about this all the time, but they miss the basic point. Sovereignty is a way that nations defend their national interests. And every nation has a right to defend its national interests, and for people to elect governments that they think will do the job of protecting their national interests. But look at the Blair Doctrine, the responsibility to protect. Look at what you were talking about, Bush, the idea that we know better than the people of Syria who should be the government of Syria. Therefore, we have a moral duty to overthrow the Assad government. That was the approach that was taken that led to this bloody civil war, which is still going on. We still have American troops in Syria. So that's where the Peace of Westphalia, which says that you don't interfere in the affairs of others, but you have diplomacy. You try and find common ground as opposed to dictating terms. And then you have this Atlantic Council idea of authoritarian countries versus the democracies. Well, it's the so-called democracies which are dictating the terms of the rules-based order. It's completely inverted. And yet people don't seem to understand that.
Yes. Well, that's certainly the case. And I'm going to make one final remark before we close. But you mentioned Syria. And I created a real firestorm back in 2015 when I wrote a letter to President Assad, and I told him, I said, I write to thank the Syrian Arab Army for its gallant operation that cleared the mountain range between Lebanon and Syria of Al-Qaeda-linked fighters. And I said, particularly, I thank you for rescuing the 13 Catholic nuns who were held as human shields. And then I said, I cannot explain to you why the United States, which was attacked by Al-Qaeda on 9/11, is now in alliance with Al-Qaeda in Syria. Now, this is just 10 years from 9/11. And all of a sudden, we're all in. We're supplying weapons, intelligence. We're channeling jihadist fighters into the country. And, people were very shocked by what happened when Hamas attacked the Israeli settlements on October the 7th. But what they don't realize is that the United States, working through the Central Intelligence Agency with Operation Timber Sycamore, that provided all of the weapons supplies that came into Syria to fund ISIS, to fund Al-Qaeda, to fund all of the array of subsidiary organizations that were led by Al-Qaeda. We carried out the most bloody vicious campaign that involved human immolations, crucifixions, human slavery, where there were slave markets where they had printed price lists for how much you had to pay for a woman, how much you had to pay for a little girl, and the little girls went for the highest price. And we were channeling all of these jihadists. It is the most hideous thing in the world, and yet, you know, we've had the killing of the settlers outside of Gaza, which was a very terrible thing. But Americans aren't even aware that we carried out 100 actions of that magnitude in Syria during the time that we have, through the Central Intelligence Agency, through DOD, we have promoted the massive slaughter and literally a campaign of mass rape. This wasn't just rapes that occurred like happens in war. This was a policy of Al-Qaeda, which we knew, we understood, and I don't know that we literally directed it out of the Central Intelligence Agency, but we knew it was going on and we had no interest in it. That campaign of mass rape in Syria was so severe that it forced the Syrian government to enact legislation to change the way that citizenship was determined in Syria, because under Islamic law, typically the citizenship derives from the father. And because you had all of these people sent by the Central Intelligence Agency that impregnated just hundreds of thousands of women, they had to change the law of Syria so that you didn't have all of these filthy jihadists from all around the world who could claim that the parentage of their children this person was really a Tunisian or whatever. So it's just astounding how effectively the American media is able to compartmentalize, and we look at what happens to the Israeli settlements and we say this is a horror, and it was. But then we look at Syria and we say, oh, Assad is bad because his constitution isn't as perfect as we think it should be. Well, it's a lot more perfect than that of Saudi Arabia, which doesn't have any constitution, and a lot of these countries in the Middle East don't.
Senator Black, if I could just inject a footnote going back to what you were saying about U.S. support for and arming and training of the terrorists in Syria. Netanyahu has admitted conduiting over $1 billion to Hamas through Qatar over the last decade. And then he comes around and says, now we have to annihilate them. But his intention in building up Hamas was to avoid the international law, which says there should be a two-state solution to the crisis in Palestine. So once again, the United States, the American people don't know this. The Israeli press has been reporting what Netanyahu admitted. Netanyahu is bragging that this money was used to break apart the old Arafat PLO and Hamas, split them so they could never form a unified party for a state. And that has a lot to do with what happened on October 7th. So I think this question, the point you're making about hypocrisy and the lack of reporting on this is one of the key reasons why the United States is becoming so isolated internationally.
Well, I think that's a good final comment. We've run a bit over time, but I think I found your commentary very intriguing and worth pursuing, Harley. So I'm going to sign off. Wish everyone a very Merry Christmas, and Harley, I think about my days over there going to the Chris Crindle marts at Christmas time. Wonderful, beautiful things, and so I wish everyone in Germany a very Merry Christmas. What is it, Frohe Weihnachten?
Weihnachten, yeah.
Weihnachten. And anyway, thank you very much for being with us. And I thank everyone for joining us today. This has been Focus on the News with Senator Black and our guest, Harley Schlanger. Thank you very much.